Simons, and I'm a state district court judge in Washoe County, Nevada. And I'm going to ask all of you to take a very deep breath right now. Thank you.
My name is Murray Snow, and I'm the Chief Judge for the Federal District of Arizona Federal Court.
Good afternoon. My name is Tammy Waller, and I am the Director for K-12 Social Studies and World and Native Languages, also in Arizona at the Department of Education.
And this is Unit 6, and will you introduce yourselves?
I'm Jackson Peterson.
I'm Swan Doe.
And I'm Tristan Opbrook. And we also have our teacher behind the camera, Mr. Patrick Gainey.
All right, so we're going to talk about what challenges might face American constitutional democracy in the 21st century. President Dwight D. Eisenhower said, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Do you agree or disagree, and why?" Also discuss what disagreements did the founders have about a standing army, and are they relevant today? To what extent should there be an international U.S. military presence? You may begin.
On January 17th, 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower delivered his farewell resignation, and with it, a somber reminder of the threats of the misappropriation of power within the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex is the dangerous entanglement of a nation's military and private defense companies, and we agree with Eisenhower's conclusion. The military-industrial complex can and does pose a threat to American democracy. The gross expenditure of the US military and the growing power of the private defense industry over public policy exemplifies a rise of misplaced power. Since Eisenhower's resignation, military spending has drastically increased. Taking inflation into account, the US defense spending was about $427 billion in 1961. Compare that to today's $730 billion budget, which accounts for 53% of the federal discretionary funding for fiscal year 2019. The next largest percentage allocated to any group was 9% towards the government and a measly 6% towards housing and community. The financial disparity between the military and public programs should be setting off alarm bells. Another cause for concern is the influence these private companies have on legislation. With billions of dollars being exchanged from the government to defense companies, it's no surprise that many of these companies have lobbyists advocating for them on Congress floor.
Eisenhower's wariness was nothing new. After escaping the tyranny of Great Britain, the founding fathers were apprehensive about the misuse of concentrated power. On the issue of a standing army, the general consensus among them was a distrust of too much authority in the military. With that being said, there were differences in opinion between the two dominant political parties at the time, Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Constitution's Army Clause, allowing Congress to raise and support armies, sparked a nationwide debate. Federalists, who were in favor of a strong military force, defended this clause, whereas the Anti-Federalists, who were satisfied with state militias, largely opposed it. The Federalists later elaborated their position on a standing army in Federalist number 29, which expresses that state militias were okay, but were inadequate to meet the national security needs of the nation. The Federalists later justified a federal army and attempted to alleviate concerns about future abuses by stating that the power of the military will not surpass the liberty and will of the people. Even so, the concerns shared by Anti-Federalists were valid and justified, and as James Madison pointed out, the means against foreign danger have always been the instruments of tyranny at home. Looking at current issues and analyzing the relevance of a standing army today, we see that this power has been abused in movements like Black Lives Matter, where the government dispatched the National Guard to disrupt protests without state consent, embodying the very fears that the founding fathers had regarding a standing army.
In the information age, pure isolationism isn't an option for any developed country. And as such, intervention in foreign affairs is something that all countries partake in. It's not a question of participation, but rather a question of extent. The US in particular has over 800 military bases spanning almost 100 countries. And with the recent news of our withdrawal from the Middle East, many Americans are asking themselves the question we seek to answer today. In our opinion, it's important to strike a balance between protecting and spreading domestic interests and staying out of foreign affairs to protect foreign diversity and respect international law. We firmly believe that in spite of our military's necessity in parts of the world, such as in international defense from China, our military is far over budget, especially given the current political climate and our competitors' spending. The US spends more than the next 10 countries combined in military spending, including China, Russia, and India, and even spends more than the entire European Union. The cost of maintaining our foreign involvement is reason enough to resort to other methods, such as trade or political interventions. However, we fail in more than that regard. In just war doctrine, the protection of innocent lives, justice, and proportionality of response are all essential to a successful and fair foreign intervention. The US has never and continues to not meet the specifications for a proper response to an international issue. Furthermore, the world has been in an unprecedented time of peace, where the world's powers have ceased to engage in open conflict. Wars still happen, people still die, but the vast majority of the world is at peace. To quote Eisenhower, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in a final sense, a theft from those who are hungry and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world is not spending its money alone. It's spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, and the hopes of its children. We are now ready to take your questions.
Thank you. Following up on your conversation and your position that intervention globally is really a question of to what extent. Using the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea as an example, what are the positive and or negative aspects of a US military presence there?
In regards to the islands, I assume you also mean the entire Eastern China Sea, as they call it. I believe that our presence there is important to signify that we do stand by the countries of Japan and South Korea in the fact that those are international waters and do not belong to any one country, and that any aggressions against our allies are therefore aggressions against us as well.
To whom or what did the framers give control, the framers in the Constitution give control over the military? And was that power allocation sufficient to prevent abuse of military power?
So that's kind of what Swan was outlining in her speech. There was a lot of debate over who should have the most control over the military, and generally the Federalists and Anti-Federalists agreed, just having come from the tyranny of Britain, that a larger military would have been disastrous. So we kind of saw the formation of the National Guards, and I think there was more intention for states to have control over their own militaries. And the reason we do have such a strong federal military now is because of the Federalist argument, which was that we needed something more unified in the sense of national security.
And I think you see that rise of military power on the federal level correspond with the increasing power of our executive branch throughout the years. And especially as we get more and more involved in international affairs, it's just having local state militias is just not viable.
Additionally, in the instance that we brought up in our prepared speech about how this power was misused, and in today's time with the Black Lives Matter movements and how the National Guard was sent in without state consent, this was clearly an overstep of power, and it reflected the fears that the people back then during the times of our founding fathers had when they were constructing a standing army.
Okay, so I want to kind of follow up on that issue of the National Guard and the Black Lives Matter protest. Can you think of any circumstances where the National Guard should be deployed domestically? And if so, can you give an example?
In a sense, I feel that the military being used against American citizens it does not reflect, and it contradicts the traditional principles and values of America. And so, especially in this instance that we brought up about how the government did not receive state consent to send in the National Guard, that was definitely a factor on why this was an unjust use of sending in military power. So I suppose if we did attain consent from the state and there was reasonable cause to send in the National Guard to alleviate these issues, which I feel that the instance that they sent in the National Guard against peaceful protesters, that was an unjust move.
In addition to what Swan said, another topic that comes to mind is the January 6th insurrection. The National Guard was not sent in and was refused, and even Maryland had offered their own state guard to try to come in and disperse protesters. However, DC also refused that. And I think at a certain point, you have to realize the depth of the situation and kind of set aside party politics to try to disperse these riots and fix issues that we have. But I genuinely agree with Swan that given state consent, the National Guard should be used.
Do you think that the government should require all citizens to register for selective service? Why or why not?
I personally do not think that you should be required to register for selective service. I think we pride ourselves on freedom and specifically bodily autonomy, and also the right to associate. And I think when we force people to register for selective service and force them to leave their businesses and their families and their communities to go overseas, I think that's like a direct violation of someone's personal freedoms.
I think if the military truly does belong to the people, then if a war is drastic enough where we have to employ selective service and start a draft, then I think the majority of people should see it, that it is a big enough issue that they should just sign up for the military regardless.
On a voluntary basis as opposed to selective service?
Yes.
Should junior reserve officer training corps programs recruit students in high schools? Why or why not?
Personally, I also do not believe they should. So we saw a lot of that, the presence of military recruiting officers come with the No Child Left Behind Act, which allowed military personnel to have the same amount of presence in school as college recruiters. And I think to equate the military to college is, it's a little alarming, simply because we put more emphasis on going overseas and like securing American ideals in places that aren't America, rather than trying to further the education of our community and our nation.
Additionally, going off of what Jackson is saying, I feel that with these high school students who are trying to figure out their lives, they're not 100% sure what they want to do. And for these military recruiters to promise them education and all of these benefits for them to go overseas and for them to like not understand the full risk and what they're getting themselves into is a little worrying.
I'm going to go back to something that you said at the very end of your opening statement. You talked about just war doctrine and how the U.S. Has been violating just war doctrine. Are there any examples that you can give us to support this?
I mean, I really think any sort of international response the U.S. has had in its history has been an overreach. If you specifically want to talk about our relations in the Middle East, I mean, it's 20 years past 9/11, and we are just now stepping out after establishing more than 100 military bases in Afghanistan, Iraq. It is a huge overstep of power from the United States to try to spread its ideals there as well. Being in a country to fight a domestic terrorist group is one thing, but to try to influence the political atmosphere of that country is a completely different thing. And especially given our response to the pandemic and the amount of people who have, can I finish that thought?
Yeah.
You may.
And the amount of people who have passed in that versus who have passed in 9/11, I think our response in the Middle East has been far too drastic.
All right, good job. So now you can breathe again. I really enjoyed it. I thought you did a good job. I thought you had great volume, but I would slow down just a bit in the beginning. I know that you've completely timed your testimony to fit right within that 4 minutes, but make sure to let us catch up with you. But I enjoyed the cross-examinations. And of course, my question fed right off your position that, you know, there are nuances to intervention. And I thought the way you said that, you have to strike a balance, and that it's a question of extent was well thought out. So I enjoyed it. Thank you.
I also enjoyed the presentation. I do think there were some, what I thought were some of your high points was you realize that the idea about deploying the National Guard domestically is really the idea of a federal military being used against its own citizens, something that we've looked at this past year that we don't frequently look at. And I think that you stated that in a way that indicates you understood the seriousness of that, and that's very good. I would wrap a little bit of an idea, though, that a citizen in the United States has rights as a federal citizen and as a state citizen. And there certainly have been times in the past where we've deployed the federal military when, for example, African Americans weren't allowed in schools, to guarantee their rights to have an equal education. So there really are times when it's appropriate. And I think your presentation would have been slightly strengthened to look at some of those times and to look at some of the justifications recently argued, even though you reject them, and to state them so that we're at least aware that you know what it is that you're contesting. But again, I thought it was a very good way of placing the issue, recognizing it, and I enjoyed the presentation.
I also enjoyed your presentation. I like how you set up the argument that it's the relationship with Congress and funding and lobbying that is one of the largest problems. I also like your passion and your conviction as you're answering the questions. I thought that you did a good job of supporting your claims. I just think the reason I asked you that last question is that's a pretty big thing to say in an opening statement. So just have an example as part of that, or you're asking for the follow-up, which is good also. I thought you guys did a great job, and I enjoyed your presentation as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done. And with that, I will wish you good luck for the rest of the day. This really was a great session, and you are free to go.
Thank you for your time. Thank you
Thank
so
you for your
much.
time.